I've caught myself in cycles of attempted abstinence, followed by withdrawal symptoms, probably more than any other drug, including sugar. Social media is my vice, and I desperately want to quit. But we live in a complex world where our lives have become so interdependent on these platforms. I've observed that I have a harder time focusing, a harder time paying attention in general. I have a much shorter attention span. My recall is horrible. So it's had a really big effect on my memory, my ability to retain information, and really deep, complex, nuanced problem solving. There's this kind of image that I see in my mind's eye when I think about my relationship with social media, when I think about social media in general, and it is this matrix thing where you feel very plugged in, and I kind of think that every time I open my phone and I start scrolling, that I'm sort of opening this window or this portal to this infinite machine, and there is this harvesting of attention. We built these platforms to share what we're going through, but we're actually distorting our ability to truly understand what that is. For a while now, I've observed myself in a very complicated relationship with social media, longing, pining to live without it, going to uninstall the app, savoring the precious few moments of life free from screen time, only to then reinstall it right back. I've caught myself in cycles of attempted abstinence, followed by withdrawal symptoms, probably more than any other drug, including sugar. Social media is my vice, and I desperately want to quit. But we live in a complex world where our lives have become so interdependent on these platforms, and therein lies the rub. In today's episode, I will explore the ways in which social media governs our lives, examine the possibility of healthy engagement, and assess the viability of a successful termination. Let's dive in. So I recently read Johann Hari's book, Stolen Focus, which if you haven't read it, I'd highly recommend. It starts off very strong, kind of tapers towards the end, unless you are someone that has attention hyperactive deficit disorder, in which case, the last half might be more relevant for you or more interesting to you. Johann is one of my favorite journalists. If you don't know who he is, he wrote Lost Connections, Chasing the Scream, used to write for The Guardian, and he currently has a book coming out on Ozempic and weight loss drugs. So have a look out for that. I think it's going to be great. In Stolen Focus, he wrote about his relationship with his godson, who is 9 years old and addicted to his smartphone, or just addicted, spends a lot of time on his smartphone. So he strikes up a deal with him and says, I'm going to take you to Graceland in Memphis. They're sort of like the Disneyland for Elvis fans, right? So the deal that they make is, I'll pay for all the flights, I'll pay for the hotels, I'll cover the whole trip, I'm going to take you on this amazing holiday experience, but only if you don't look at your phone throughout the day. You have to have it turned off. You can turn your phone on when we're back at the hotel at night. So the kid's like, yeah, absolutely, that sounds great. So they make this deal. They go all the way from the UK to Memphis to have this trip. And when they get there, I think on like the second or the third day, the kid is, in the corner of this room of Graceland where they're, supposed to be having a great time, and there's all this stimulus and amazing things happening. And he's checking TikTok or Instagram, kind of sitting down in the corner, and he's like, what are you doing? And he's like, well, you didn't say blah, blah, blah. And he just kind of, had this like addict behavior response, right? And I know that I've been in that situation so many times where I've bargained with myself, and I've seen it happen to so many other people. All you need to do is go out to a restaurant and look at couples or friends and see how many people are on their phones out at restaurants or cafes, and they're not really connecting with each other, right? There's all this data that indicates if you're on a date, for example, if you have your phone on the table, even if it's turned down, it decreases your ability to connect deeply on that date. So if you're dating, you need to actually have your phone in your bag away from line of vision, which is really fascinating how that is so subconscious and yet it affects us so deeply in our ability to truly connect. It's very alarming. So in the book, he writes about his concern for the loss of focus that he's observed within himself and within society at large over the last couple of years. And the book is his journey to see if we can get that back. You know, things that I've noticed in my own experience with social media when my use goes up, and even just kind of looking at not the micro of the day-to-day, but the macro and zooming out and going, you know, we've been using these apps for over a decade now, but as a business owner, I've been using these apps more rigorously, more intensely for the last 5 years. You know, social media is such a big part of how I market my business, how I present my brand. It is really integral if you're an online business owner today, especially if you're a small business owner, self-employed, personal brand, anything like that. You know, your consumption, your time spent on the app, your usage is going to be very, very high. As a regular civilian, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, my time on the app would have been maybe a couple hours a week, if that. Whereas now, on average, it's probably something like 15 hours a week, which is a lot, you know, it's a lot. So I've observed that I have a harder time focusing, a harder time paying attention in general. I have a much shorter attention span. I have really seen the effects on my memory. So if I'm doing something and I'm trying to remember what I was just reading or what I was just doing, why did I go into this room? What was I about to engage in? You know, what was I just thinking about? My recall is horrible. So it's had a really big effect on my memory, my ability to retain information. I could absorb something, read something, and completely forget it. It won't go into my long-term memory. I really have to work very hard at either repetition or association to ensure that something does go into my long-term memory. If I'm reading something and I really want to remember it and learn it, I will engage in a process of writing it down either by hand on paper, because that helps with memory recall, or I will take notes on a Google document and I'll underline a book, for example, and then I'll take that book and I'll go back and review the underlined things and then type it up in a Google document. But I basically need to go over something several times to create that repetition. And then to really cement it, I'll have to bring it into a conversation like I'm doing right now, in a one-sided conversation with you. So it's really hard for us to even just remember what we're doing because of the way that, you know, these technologies are flooding our dopamine receptors amongst many other things. I notice that I have less quality thinking. I have less critical thought, less deep thought, less unique, creative, original ideas. And that is a correlation, like not just in general, but I noticed that when I spend more time on these apps, I spend more time scrolling, there is a very mind-numbing effect that really is at odds with depth, empathy, connection, creative thinking, and really deep, complex, nuanced problem solving. So I really observe myself in this kind of like zombie-like, mindless, you know, not mindful state. And that's the opposite of what we want, right? And you can see how when we're in that state, when we're not mindful, we're not able to hold as much emotion and we lose our ability to have capacity for, you know, challenging conversations with partners, friends, family. We lose our ability to feel deeply the experience of life itself. And, you know, there's this kind of image that I see in my mind's eye when I think about my relationship with social media, when I think about social media in general. And it is this matrix-like thing where you feel very plugged in. And I kind of think that every time I open my phone and I start scrolling, that I'm sort of opening this window or this portal to this infinite machine. And there is this harvesting of attention. And, you know, it's more than just attention. It's actually this harvesting of higher realms of consciousness. And I feel this very clear sense of, you know, declining in my own level of ability, my own level of function. And that feels really scary as someone who loves personal growth and has a very high value for, you know, sovereignty, right? So there is a very clear disconnection from intuition, disconnection from body, disconnection from desire, excitement, aliveness. And this concerns me. Johan goes on this incredible journey. You know, he interviews something like 150 to 200 people, traveling 3,000 miles, something like that. And he finds strong evidence that our collapsing ability to pay attention is not an individual fault. If you are struggling to pay attention, that's not your fault. It's not my fault. This is a systemic issue now. It's being done to us, and it's being done by really powerful people or really powerful forces, big tech. And this even goes beyond them, right? So there's actually a really great book that came out recently called Techno-Capitalism. Maybe it's called Techno-Feudalism. I'm going to look into that later, and I'm probably going to dive into that in a future episode where we can look into more of the systemic nature of capitalism and big tech and what's really going on at those higher levels. But today I want to focus on the individual thing. I want to focus on our relationship to social media individually. And then at some point in the future, we can go into the, the systemic stuff. But, he talks about how this system is pouring acid on your attention, and we blame ourselves and we're like, oh, we should really get better. But, this is rigged against us. We are not set up to succeed, and we are fighting against our biological drivers, and this is not a battle that we can win, right? Because your conscious mind and your, desire to be free is only going to be able to do so much. So we are in an attention crisis right now, and this is what we're going to explore today. So in the book, he conducts a personal experiment, which is really interesting. And in that experiment, he goes to Cape Cod for 3 months, and he disconnects completely from the internet, from social media. He gets like an old brick phone that just has an emergency kind of dial to the hospital in case anything happens to his health and needs to go to the hospital. And he gets an old laptop from a friend that doesn't even dial up to the internet so that he can write. So in this 3-month block, he is completely disconnected from the modern world. He's only present, and he's mainly reading and writing. And in that first week or 2 weeks, he experiences all of these withdrawal symptoms where he's constantly reaching for his phone. He's constantly freaking out and experiencing anxiety and panic, where it's like, oh my God, I need to check my email. What about this? And what about that? And, and if you've ever tried to do a withdrawal, you'll notice the same symptoms, right? Because it is an addiction, whether you are conscious of it or not. So what's really interesting is that this experiment, 3 months is a pretty drastic and great amount of time. I've conducted, this own version for myself when I've hit pretty severe bouts of burnout or adrenal fatigue in my own life and business. One of the major factors of burnout and adrenal fatigue and, just fatigue and exhaustion in business in general is the level of social media use and consumption because of what it's doing to our mind. And I feel like I conducted, an experiment where I went to Bali silent retreat in 2021 when I was battling this like pretty badly back then. I didn't spend 3 months there. It was just a couple of days. But when you enter into an environment like that, when you're doing something like a dark retreat or a Vipassana, if you're going really intense, I think the way that Johan did it, where he sort of is living in real life normally for 3 months, that's the best way to do it versus going into an experience where it's not sustainable for you to keep going. It is, an environment that's cultivated for this very specific reason, but that's not real life. You're kind of going into this alternate reality for a week, right? So, whether it's a silent retreat like I've done or something else, you give your phone up when you walk in, you can't take anything with you. You've got maybe a journal, you've got a library of books, you can't talk. And all of a sudden, you start to experience reality very differently. Reality, or your experience of it, your perception of it, starts to really slow down. And what's interesting when you are doing this, and you can have the same type of experience when you go on holiday sometimes, like if you travel and you are away from work and you're away from the grind, and you make a conscious effort to not be on your phone as much, you will notice that time seems to move very slowly. I actually had this conversation with a couple of friends of mine. We went on a girls' trip to celebrate my 30th birthday in 2022. And during that week, we were all constantly commenting about how time was moving so slowly. And isn't this amazing? Wow, it's so strange. I haven't experienced this for a long time. Why does it feel this way? And one of my friends, Alex, who I admire for many reasons, one of which is that she has a lot of great fun facts, philosophical and otherwise, psychological. And she mentioned that, well, time slows down when you're in a new environment because you are taking in more pieces of information. And so your mind has to slow down to make sense of its surroundings to see what's going on and understand where it is. Versus when you're in a routine, when you're in, like a daily grind, your mind can essentially turn off a little bit and you can work unconsciously to just kind of go about your day. And making coffee is going to be relatively unconscious. Getting in the car and driving to work is going to be relatively unconscious. And so you don't have to take in as much information. You can just kind of go on autopilot. But when you're in a new location, you can't go on autopilot. You need to be very hyper aware of your surroundings. And when you're in that hyper aware state, because you're taking in so much information, time slows down. Your experience of it slows down, which is really interesting. If you want to experience the depth of all of the things that are around you where you're really present, you want to do things that you've never done before. And that's, part of the reason why I think we love novelty, amongst other reasons. But I think why it's really important for us to engage in new experiences, fresh experiences, to do things that we've never done before, is that you want to have a conscious way of living. You don't want to constantly be in a routine where everything is kind of automated and then you wake up one day and life passes you by. That's so terrifying, you want to really be here. You want to have an experience of living. You want to be present, and you can't be present if you're on autopilot, right? So something that I really noticed when I was on that silent retreat in 2021 was, in addition to time slowing down, and in addition to feeling very present and being very aware of things, I had an ability to notice the tiniest of details. There were these birds that were flying, through the clouds, kind of as the sun was setting. And I was like, wow, look at those birds. And, it's the type of stuff that you kind of notice when you're high, right? When you're on psychedelics and maybe you're on acid, or maybe you're on ketamine, or, maybe weed or something like that. And you just kind of notice these details because the way that you're taking in information has changed and you're not focusing on all this other stuff. You're just very, very present with all of these details, and you hyper focus on the details. And so you're more focused than anything else, right? Which is really cool. So you can create that state, without drugs. You can just create that by removing the things that bring us into autopilot. And from there, after a period of time passes and there's this discomfort of oh my God, I'm bored. Oh my God, I'm freaking out. Or this is so uncomfortable. Or what am I going to do with all of this time? That's really big on what am I going to do with all this time? It's time is scary. Most of us are really afraid of boredom. We're really afraid of being bored, right? Think about how often, you might be waiting for a friend or a partner and maybe they're running late and you think, oh, well, now I have to wait for them and I'm bored. And so I'm now going to whip out my phone and start scrolling. And we do things to pass the time or to kill time. But why would you want to kill time? Think about that, really. The amount of how many times you've said, just going to kill some time. Why do we have this habit now where we will try and do things to fill this time that is actually our most precious resource, and we just give it away, we kill it, we murder it? Where did that even come from? Where did that originate from? That's kind of mad. What we could do, and easier said than done, but I think this is a really great opportunity to practice more mindfulness. And I think, these small habits stack, and I think this could potentially make a really big difference to our mental health and our empathy and our ability to connect, is rather than trying to kill time and pass it by, with scrolling and consuming, why don't you just sit there and be in that moment of stillness for as long as it is? Because you can experience time differently through active meditation, with your eyes open, by just taking in what's around you, but actually focusing and cultivating on presence rather than mindlessness. And, that's something that I've been playing with a little bit here and there. Rather than whip out the phone, I've kind of just sat in these very boring places, maybe you're at a bus stop, or maybe you're in an Uber, or maybe you're whatever, right? You're at a restaurant. But rather than just reaching for the phone, why don't you take a moment to look at the surroundings and take a moment to be wow, look at where I am, and I'm here. And isn't that interesting? Let me take in that I am here. Let me really sit in this moment rather than letting it pass me by. Because I think that's a small thing that we can all do immediately, doesn't cost anything, that, when that stacks up, it can make a really big difference. So something else that I notice on that silent retreat, and just, whenever I take these bouts of absence, or like these disconnects and resets, as I call them, is that all of a sudden my original thought and my creative thought starts to come back online, and I start to have creative ideas about books that I could write, or stories that I want to tell, films that I could make, and I'll have ideas about podcast episodes or things, that I think are really interesting. And I'll be like, oh, that's a great conversation. That could be really cool. Or how about this idea? Like, I'll just have ideas, and even my ability to then problem solve, because, that's a similar thinking, right? Creative thinking is problem solving. And so then all of a sudden these problems that I might have, whether it's, in personal life or in the business, my mind will just come up with solutions for those problems. So there's a lot to be said for the process of just being present and mindful, and really removing yourself from that mindlessness, from that scrolling, right? In the creative world, we call that creative loafing. Just having that spaciousness for something to pop up. And Elizabeth Gilbert talks about that in Big Magic. And I think it's such an important practice, is to have that white space in your calendar, or to just have that time, and that space for creativity or inspiration to arrive, for it to strike and tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, would you like to steward me as an idea? Would you like to pair up and actualize me and bring me into reality? So I think it's really important that we are aware of the amount of time that we spend in these states, mindless and mindful, right? I think that, this is sort of like the mental equivalent to fasting. When we fast, think about it, the digestive system gets a break from needing to do all of the work. Like our digestive system works so hard in our modern world with all of the complex ways that we eat processed food, fast food, we mix ingredients, we don't eat seasonally, we eat things that are not natural to our origin. Like if you're Chinese and you grew up in China and then you're eating Italian food all the time, like that is going to have an effect on your body. We're actually supposed to eat based on, the origins of our genetics. We're programmed to digest particular food groups. And if you live in a modern society in a big city like New York, Melbourne, LA, whatever, and you live in a metropolis where there is a wide array of food options, and, you could have Thai tonight, Vietnamese tomorrow, you can have Moroccan the next day, you can have Argentinian steak the day after that. And you are constantly chasing variety, like me, because I fucking love variety. Then you are actually putting a lot of strain on your digestive system, because your digestion doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know what's happening. It's not designed to be consuming all of these different food groups and that level of complexity. We're actually designed to eat quite simply. We're designed to eat whole foods and to not have so many different things on the plate. It should just kind of be like maybe 2 or 3 things on the plate. And when you simplify and you take out all of the myriad 100 ingredients, your digestion works a lot better. We need to eat less. We need to eat simpler. It's easier said than done though, right? This is the world that we live in. And we also need to realize that, again, systemically, it's set up against us, right? So you're going against the grain if you want to eat that way and do what we're actually supposed to do. And same with social media. So we're working hard. The body's working hard. And when we fast and we give it that break, it then gets an opportunity to return itself to homeostasis. And so if you've ever heard the saying, the body is intelligent, it knows what to do. The body always knows what to do to return itself to health. It does. But the mind, I believe, is also the same, because the mind is neuroplastic. So in the same way that the body is intelligent, the mind is also intelligent. And I think that it knows how to regulate. It knows how to regulate emotions and downregulate thoughts, feelings, all of these things, right? I think in our natural state, we are actually thriving and mentally healthy and excited and happy. And I think that when we are living with the technology and the habits that we do, our minds don't actually get a break to fast and reset and restore all of our pathways to homeostasis. The mind is plastic. And it's malleable, and it knows what to do to return everything to its rightful state of homeostasis. So it knows how to regulate your neurotransmitters of serotonin, norepinephrine, all of these things that bring you to the here and now where you can actually be present and appreciating and grateful and taking in your experience of reality. But if we are messing with our mind's ability, our brain's ability to regulate those neurotransmitters, then yeah, we're going to have a really hard time being present. So it's easy to say, oh, we'll just sit down and be present and meditate. But the brain has a job. And if we don't give the brain a break to do what it needs to do to regulate those chemicals that are really important for our emotional state, then yeah, it can be really hard and we can be fighting against ourselves. So think about that. This is mental fasting. This is emotional fasting. This is giving your brain a break and an opportunity to return all of your body's natural brilliance and ability to truly be happy, to truly experience the magic of the here and now. You have that ability. And if it's hard, you need to be asking yourself why it's so hard, because that's your natural state. The problem with these resets where we are heavily consuming social media and technology, our phones, for several months or years at a time, and then doing something drastic like doing a week-long Vipassana or a darkness retreat or a silent retreat or something like that, is that it's unsustainable. And it's the equivalent to having a really poor diet where you're binge eating or eating junk food for several months or years at a time, and then fasting for 1 week, or you're doing a 1-month water fast. That's not a healthy, sustainable way to live, because if we're doing that, all we're doing is oscillating at two ends of the extreme. What we want to do is think about how we can have an ongoing, sustainable practice where we're relating to this thing. How can we relate to food in a healthy way where we're not just going from one end to the other? How can we relate to technology, to our smartphones, to social media in a healthy way? And I think if I were to suggest something that may work for some people, and I don't think that this would work for everyone, if you are a business owner, you could try having 5 days a week where it's timed and you go, cool, I'm on this to do these very specific activities for this amount of hours, but it's only Monday to Friday. And the moment that I finish work on Friday, I put my phone away. I would suggest having a work phone and having a home phone or a personal phone. And then you have your personal phone that doesn't have those apps. It doesn't have any of that stuff. I don't know, maybe it's an older brick phone. Maybe it's a BlackBerry, I don't know. And you don't go on during the weekend. And so maybe during the weekend, for 2 out of 7 days, that's your reset time. And maybe that's a sustainable thing that you can do. I know some people that do that pretty effectively. They just don't go on the weekend. And when they come back in on Monday, they feel really refreshed. They feel like they've actually had a break. But what I really see so much with entrepreneurs, especially online entrepreneurs, and if you're doing your own marketing or a personal brand, if you're a creator or anything like that, there is no break. And if you have a job where you're working at an office, you get that break. You get to leave the office, but most of us never get to leave the office of our own business. And when your phone is such a core part of your business, it's with you all the time. And I've seen that drive people to levels of burnout. I've seen it drive people to really dark insomnia, to, having panic attacks because they're always on. We need to be able to turn off. We need that disconnection. So I would try the 5 on, 2 off approach if you can. I think that's a realistic way that we can navigate that and think about it like this, right? People who are exercising and, really have their they track their macros, or, they have their healthy diet, usually they'll have a cheat day. So think about that. It's the inverse kind of effect where you use it as minimally as you can to necessity, and then you find a way to draw that line where you can have your reset. And so maybe that's something that we can try. In the book, Johan interviews Soon Lemon, who is a professor of applied mathematics and computer science at the Technical University of Denmark. And Soon and his colleagues conducted experiments that validated the collective shrinking of our attention spans. So this is a really interesting study because it also shows that the cost of having more information, because we have more than ever before, and it's reaching us faster, it's more readily available, you can just quickly search things on your phone, but the cost of that is not only our energy and our focus, it's also depth. For example, when you speed read, scientists found that you don't actually absorb what you're reading. And so whenever you try to do something faster, you sacrifice or compromise on the depth or the retention. So what's really interesting here is that there's also an opposite effect that scientists have been able to observe, which is that when you engage in deliberately slow practices such as Tai Chi, meditation, or Qigong, you actually improve your ability to pay attention. So we have this association now that has been measured, it's been tested. When we go fast, we sacrifice depth and attention. When we go slow, we increase attention, and we also increase and open up more flexibility, creative thinking, and depth of problem solving. I've really observed the same phenomenon in business as well. Like, I've seen a lot of people try to scale really quickly, grow really quickly, move super fast. Myself included, I've had phases where the focus has been trying to scale at all costs, right? And when you do that, and you see a lot of people do this in Silicon Valley, and there are these slogans like, if you're not moving fast enough, like if it's not broken, then you're not moving fast enough. And yeah, because when you move really fast, when your priority is scaling really quickly, things are going to break. Code breaks, apps break, platforms, the engineers, everything breaks, right? But you also need to be mindful that like people can break. I've seen team members break because I've been like, we need to move faster, we need to go faster. And, I've had moments in my business where I've had people break down and be like, like I'm stressed or I'm anxious, like I've had those moments. And this is rare. This has maybe happened once or twice where people have been stressed. But I've seen it even in startups that I've worked at where people have broken because there's so much pressure to move so quickly. And then that will do something internally to the psyche, right? So, things are affected. Client delivery is affected. Onboarding is glitchy. The actual quality of the product, what's being built is not as quality as it could be or as it should be, right? We sacrifice quality when we prioritize speed. And so I think what's really important is for you to ask yourself, why am I prioritizing speed? Because it comes at a cost. And are you willing to make that sacrifice? Do you want to have something that is slow, where all of the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, everybody's calm, everybody's happy, you have that longevity? Like, why do you need to grow fast? Why do we need to move through life at this speed? There's a real beauty in slowness. And I think that we can learn a lot from the East where they do move slowly, and there is that philosophy that slow is better, right? So I think that's really interesting that this has actually been studied as a phenomenon and that there is that sacrifice. And I think that it's really valuable for us to be more conscious of that. For me, in my own relationship with social media that I've been examining for the last couple years, it was always kind of at the point where I thought, I need this in order to run my business successfully. I need this in order to have relationships with people. This is how I have conversations with so many people. It's how I engage with potential clients. It's how I sell. It's how I market. This is a necessary evil. It's obviously helping me a lot. It helps in many ways. It's not just all bad. It's obviously super beneficial. We're definitely not discounting or discrediting the benefits in any way. But I got to a point probably within the last year, the last 6 months maybe, where I started to really observe my own cognitive decline. And I started to observe that as I was working on my second manuscript, which is a nonfiction about personal development, it's specifically about some Eastern philosophies and how we can apply practical Western science to achieve certain things. And I'll talk to you about it another time. It's a great book. I'm really excited about it. But as I started to write that manuscript, I noticed that it was really hard for me to pay attention when a couple of years ago, it was a lot easier to just sit down, have a 2 or 3 hour writing bout. But it takes me longer to get into flow now. It used to take me maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Now it might take me 40 to 45. So it takes me a longer amount of time to get into flow. Once I'm in flow, I'm not in there for as long. I can't stay in there for 3 or 4 hours. I might be in there for an hour and a half. Then when I'm in there, my quality of thought is not as good as it used to be. My mind's not as sharp as it used to be. And, there are definitely a myriad of factors there, from diet and exercise and, my digestive system and brain fog and mold and candida and adrenals and things like that. But I definitely can see a correlation between my social media consumption on the micro scale, where I'm looking at it daily or I'm looking at it weekly. And I can see that, when that screen time is high, that my ability to write and work on a book and think in terms of in a long form manner, that is severely compromised. And then when I look at the macro and I go, okay, I started running a business or attempting to run a business in 2018 and really kind of going all in 2019, but I quit my job. And so my lifestyle really actively changed in 2018. So for the last almost 6 years, my screen time and my reliance on social media has been very, very high. And so if I think about what can happen over a 6-year period, a lot can decline. And that's the macro, that's the long-term effect. So I'm very, very cognizant of that. And I think I'm at the point now where a really big priority for me is creative thinking. It is problem solving. It is my ability to come up with new ideas, to convey them in a way that is, that I'm happy with, in a way that communicates the ideas effectively. And the priority for me is on that long form content creation. It is on the longevity of things that I really value, such as books. And so my value and my need for creating short-term content, in order to build and grow a business isn't the same as it was 2 or 3 years ago when I was really needing that. Right now, my value and my priority is really on creating long form pieces of content in the form of films, books, screenplays, podcast episodes like this, that I can put a lot of thought and care into and really develop them and really focus on the nuance and focus on the complexity of the idea to convey it and hopefully have really meaningful, engaging conversations with people. That really lights me up. It's really fulfilling for me, and I feel really alive when I'm doing those things. I feel really creative. I feel really turned on. So now I'm at a point where there's this kind of, there is a choice to be made where I'm like, okay, I can see that social media and technology is severely impacting something that is the most meaningful and fulfilling thing for me. So I'm now at a net negative, whereas before it was an absolute clear net positive. It was serving me in building a business, and that was my highest priority. And I was, making money and building a brand was my highest priority. So now I am contemplating, why is it hard for me to write this book? Why am I struggling to write this manuscript when, I feel like it shouldn't be this hard, right? Something that's really interesting, I've had this kind of thought for a while, but I didn't have the evidence for it. I thought that I'm struggling to think in a way where I can think about, an entire novel, or I can think about, how a whole chapter might play out, a chapter being maybe 20 or 30 pages, something like that. I can write 1 page, I can write 2 pages, I can write like a short little bit, but I don't, and my mind just isn't thinking about the longer form of how this can work. And so I was like, I wonder if that has anything to do with social media. And then in Johan's book, I found this really validating piece of research. He interviewed Anne Mangan, a professor of literacy at Stavanger University, who explains that reading books actually trains us to read in a particular way, in a linear fashion, focused on one thing for a sustained period. Whereas reading from a screen trains us to manically skip and jump from one thing to another. So Anne conducted studies with 2 groups of people. One group reads the same information from a printed booklet, and the other group reads the same information from a screen. Then when they're both asked questions to recall what they just read, the group that read from the paper booklet is able to recall significantly better than the group that reads from the screens. There have been over 54 studies conducted on this. So we know that when we read from screens, we are not absorbing as effectively. And so that's just, again, memory and recall. But what's really interesting is the way that we take in the information and the way that that shapes how we view and understand reality. And this is where it gets to be really dangerous. Think about different types of social media. Think about Twitter. You have a 280 character count of short, sometimes often polarizing sentences that are sweeping, sometimes generalizations, but they are radically oversimplifying a lot of complex, nuanced topics. And when you are consuming these oversimplified statements, you are training yourself to see the world in that way. And then you'll start to unconsciously interpret the world in an oversimplified manner. Think about the different formats of Facebook, Instagram, and how it's training you to see through the lens of what is essentially just a fragment of reality. So as I've mentioned, our minds are neuroplastic, they're malleable, they're easily shaped and easily influenced. And if you are taking in your data points of reality through these lenses, then you're going to start to think in that way. And so if we look at the world today and we look at how polarizing it is, we look at how divisive it is, we look at how people are just constantly disagreeing and oversimplifying, people are missing the point a lot of the time. This is because of the way that we're consuming information. It's because of the limitation of the character count. It's because it is impossible to convey something complex and accurate through a carousel or a 60-second reel. How can you possibly do that? Think about TikToks. Think about the manic speed at which those videos are edited. And think about what that's going to do to a person's brain if they are absorbing information at that pace, at that speed, in that weird manic way. That's going to start to create disorders over time. And I think that there's already a very popular general consensus that, the format of TikTok is becoming very dangerous. But I want you to just really realize that the nature of how information and content is conveyed through the confines of these platforms creates the perception of an alternate reality rather than a window to an actual one. I would personally go so far as to say that long form content, meaning books, films, actual cinema, not short films, on Instagram that are made for social media, films, classic films, these things are better for our cognitive function. They're better for our emotional intelligence and our mental health because they create real worlds. There's real depth of character that we can connect to and understand the emotions, the complexities of the mind, of situations, and of the human experience. And that's the whole point of these mediums. But we're not doing that in these short form bits of content. And so we're actually cutting ourselves off from an ability to really understand the human experience. We built these platforms to connect. We built these platforms to share what we're going through, but we're actually distorting our ability to truly understand what that is, because of the nature of the form, because of the restrictions and the limitations of character and time. There was recently a trend sweeping across TikTok and Instagram called social media is fake. Maybe you saw it. And the premise was to encourage people to share vulnerably in an attempt to open this window to reality, to remind us all that what we see is merely a very skewed perception and it shouldn't be taken as the whole truth. I thought this was a really beautiful sentiment. So I created my own reel and I posted on Instagram, and it was received largely in the way that it was intended. But the other day I saw someone post something along the lines of, this social media fake trend is great, but I think what would be even better is bragging about ourselves. And obviously this is someone in the self-help industry. We should brag on ourselves. And I was like, yeah, okay. But you have completely missed the salience of the idea. We're not sharing, things that we're ashamed of so that we can humble ourselves and, have more humility. We're not highlighting our flaws or our weaknesses. This is about reminding consumers to not form their perception of reality based on these incomplete glimpses into someone's life. A reel, a carousel, a story will never capture the true essence of a moment in time, nor will it ever capture the depth of an idea. We need to remember that social media content is not literature. It's not cinema. And most importantly, it's not scientific or medical advice. We're training our minds to see the world through fragments of what it really is. We're not training ourselves to ask the right questions or look at the wider context. And I think that this has also a really dire impact on our physical health and well-being because of all of the advice that we're taking, the pop psychology, the diet advice, the weight loss advice, take this supplement, biohacking that. And, I'm really for biohacking as a principle of returning to nature. But I think that there's a lot of try this peptide or try this without the context, right? And I think a really good example is ice baths. Everyone loves to share their cold plunging, the ice baths on social media, and myself included. I did this for a long time because, it's really impressive that you can do this and you can stay in there for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And look at me, and I'm an Iron Man. But the problem with this is that when this trend took off, and people were sharing about the benefits to your vagal nerve and, the tone and your nervous system. And that's primarily why I was doing it. There's also a lot of science that people weren't sharing. And maybe it's because they didn't know, or maybe it's because of the format. And I think that, again, my whole point here is that you need to not be taking advice through social media alone, that you need to actually be getting real science in a different context, in a different format, is that ice baths or cold plunging for women is actually really detrimental to your body 75 to 80% of the time because of the way that it damages your hormones, and more specifically, the effects that it has on your kidneys. Now, I have done really bad damage to my kidneys from probably 2.5 years of constant ice baths and cold temperatures. And I've been sitting there regulating my nervous system, being I'm so regulated, and doing all this harm to my kidneys, which then were no longer able to properly clean my blood. And I was getting these really big buildups of uric acid in my blood. And that's not something that you would be aware of unless you went really deep down the rabbit hole of testing your blood, looking at what's going on, and really understanding kidney function, which the vast majority of people don't. So if you're a woman and you're jumping on the bandwagon of ice bathing, cold plunging, even cryotherapy, anything like that, and you are doing it at the wrong time of month, you need to really be careful and understand and track your cycles. And I mean, to be honest with you, I've actually just stopped altogether because I'm really focusing on looking after my kidneys now. So that is a really great example of how we take a piece of information this is really good for your nervous system. Oh, this is really good. It releases norepinephrine. And we then go, okay, cool, I'm going to do that. And here are the benefits, berberine is the latest supplement and everyone should be taking berberine because look at all these benefits of berberine, or look at the benefits of caffeine, look at the benefits of this. But we're not taking that into the wider context of our specific bodies. People aren't actually going, okay, well, what am I deficient in? And do I even need this supplementation, right? We just take this one piece of information that we've consumed on social media as a fragment of what it really is. And that is so dangerous. I'm not saying, that this is bad for you or that's bad for you. It's that we're not training our minds to do the proper work of looking at the wider context, of asking the right questions. And that's where we get into these situations where we then have to go and clean up all of these negative after effects. I've been thinking about this saying lately, that old adage, you are what you eat. It's really more that we are what we consume. And we're spending hours every day filling our minds with incomplete fragments at best and garbage at worst. In addition to the decline of critical thinking and problem solving, it also has a really negative effect on our ability to feel empathy. So think about how quickly people go into attack mode when they disagree with others on the internet. And this is this can go into a whole other conversation on parasocial relationships and bullying and cancel culture, which we'll go into on another episode. But I think that people actually have less capacity for duality and multiple perspectives, and that we are seeing an increase in public call-outs. So I think that can also be attested to the polarization of these conversations without that wider context, without that nuance. Something that came into my attention recently was Mark Groves, the popular relationship coach. His business is called Create the Love. He has a following of over 1 million people on Instagram. And he recently shared a post stating his intention to delete all of his social media accounts on the 1st of June. For someone with over 1 million followers, this is a pretty big deal. I think that that's a really radical act of rebellion. And so I was really curious to better understand why he would want to do that. He recorded a podcast episode going into his decision in more detail, and he mainly talked about his decision from a relationship standpoint, because he is in the field of human relationships. And he really talked about this relationship with social media through the lens of addictive behavior. So he really highlighted how the algorithm is always changing, and that, you're either at the mercy of these rules being penalized or rewarded, but you end up becoming enslaved to this machine and you rely on it as a business owner for exposure. And you engage in behaviors where you are optimizing everything, and all of your activity becomes about reach, engagement, views, likes. And, you can descend into a panic when your engagement drops. Oh no, what do I need to do now? What's the latest trend? How can I get my engagement back up? And everything just becomes about the trending audios, when's the right time to post, what's the frequency of posting. And it can start to really take over your life. And if you think about it, you started your business to do whatever it is that you're passionate about, what you enjoy delivering, not to be making reels with trending audios and trying to figure out frequency, being we need to post more, we need more, the engagement, trying to get it to be optimal, that's madness. You're on a hamster wheel. And if you left a job where you were on one hamster wheel, you're now just on another hamster wheel as a slave to this algorithm, as a slave to try and figure out how you can get your content to be seen. I've never really fallen into the trap of being a slave to engagement and worrying about that. I've always just been I'm going to post high quality content, and I'm going to post at the frequency that is good for me. And maybe that's a couple times a month. Maybe I really don't even think about it, to be honest with you. I post when I have something to say. I post when I have something to sell. I don't allow myself to ever get enslaved into that because I think it's silly. But I also think that it is something that can take hold of you. And I think that there are going to be I think that people are going to have different predispositions to end up engaging in that kind of way. And so I think that if you're someone, that will have a certain psychological makeup, then you might be more predisposed to behave in that manner, right? Versus someone that will just share when they're creatively inspired to share and do things very functionally like I do. So if you are someone that has been affected by that kind of addictive nature of, becoming enslaved and feeling like you don't have any control or you don't have any power, then I think that this is a really valuable opportunity for you to assess how you can take your power back and if it's possible for you to do that. Because he described the relationship with social media as abusive, which I think is really interesting. So he likened it to being in a relationship with, an abusive narcissist where they are extracting from you, you're always giving, it's not reciprocal, our relationships with these platforms. And if you compare Facebook or Instagram, TikTok to something like YouTube, for example, you do actually get paid for the content that you create on YouTube once you get to a certain number of views, right? Even with podcasts, you can have sponsors, if you can get those sponsors, those brand deals. But a lot of the time, when you're creating content for Instagram or things like that, you're not getting paid for the content. The way that you monetize the content is through your own services. And so, you end up having many jobs, or you have a social media person or a social media team, and that becomes a really big expense for your business. My observations on the entrepreneur relationship is that we really need to be mindful of the metrics that are valuable for us to measure, rather than getting pulled into these vanity metrics that don't really matter. Because I want you to really think about it for a moment. There is a way for you to make money. You are inevitably going to make money as a business owner without having that reach be a little bit more. And also, if you are doing a post on something where you're not directly selling and it's just you talking about how your day was or what you ate today or whatever it is, the content, right? Why does it matter if that reach is a little bit lower than usual? It really doesn't. That's not going to impact your bottom line. That's not going to impact your safety. So why are you stressing about it? You know what I mean? as a business owner, what you really need to be paying attention to and measuring are customer retention, lifetime value, refund rate, profit margins, churn, cost per lead, cost per acquisition. You should not be measuring your story views and your reach and your likes and your comments. Those are not things that are going to directly equate to the money that you're making or, the success of your business. So why are you spending so much time focusing on them and then going into a state of disempowerment where you feel like you're enslaved to this, daddy algorithm? Like, just let it go. It doesn't matter. It's not going to make a difference at the end of the day. Focus on writing more compelling messaging. Focus on having a better sales page. And, obviously at the end of the day, these platforms do want you to run ads. Run ads. I'm very pro ads. I think everyone should run ads. But I really think that you're going to save a lot of your mental sanity by doing that and not trying to get more reach, because everybody knows, or if you don't know, then now you're about to, when you do a conversion post and you are actually actively selling, the reach goes down anyway. So why stress out about it? Just put a little bit of ad money behind it. People will definitely see it. Make sure you're emailing your list. If you don't have a list, you need a list. Definitely. And take your power back. Life is short, Don't waste it running for something that doesn't matter, chasing something that doesn't matter. And don't forget that it really doesn't make a big difference at the end of the day. And that's why they call them vanity metrics. So focus on the things that you do have control over, right? Think about social media as a storefront. People come and find you. The signage needs to be good, but that's it. Don't be making 3 posts a day and driving yourself insane and losing your grounding and your stability internally. I know also that a lot of people are very concerned about the censorship of social media. I have a lot of peers who are either in the sexuality space and, nudity or certain words around sex is really limiting for them and their accounts get shut down. I've had peers have their accounts get shut down, and they're sex coaches or kind of intimacy coaches, and that's a really big issue. And there's also political censorship, right? And if you're an activist or you're in social justice and you start to veer into the realm of politics, you can also get shut down. And so I've even had friends had their accounts get shut down for no reason at all. And they've lost their entire audience, all of their following. They didn't have an email list. They lost everything. So this isn't personally a huge concern for me, but I imagine that for some of my peers and for people who it is more of a concern for, that this would also have an ongoing effect on your mental health, because it's something that you would worry about, whether consciously or unconsciously, and it would take up a piece of real estate in your mind where there's this gentle hum being like, what if I get taken down? What if I lose everything? That's not going to create safety in the body. So ultimately, Mark Groves decided that he couldn't be in a healthy relationship with these platforms, which is why he's deleting it. And I think that for some people, that level of drastic measure may be necessary. I think that we can run businesses without them. I think that in some ways it's going to be harder. I think that if you have an established brand like he does, then I think that you can definitely use Google Ads. I think that you can use SEO, you can use YouTube and your podcasts and those long form pieces of content, as well as your email list, to drive the ongoing nature of your business. You can use other platforms like Telegram. But I think that if I could give advice to new business owners or younger business owners that maybe have been in the game for less than 3 years, I'm kind of in my 5th to 6th year now, and I'm experiencing this burnout and exhaustion. And I'm at the point where I really want to give this up. I dream about it. I dream about a life where I don't have a phone. I have the old brick and I live in Cape Cod or something like that. I'm not in Cape Cod, but maybe I'm in the Dolomites. You have a time limit for social media. Every creator, every business owner, every personal brand needs to know this. You have a time limit until you start to cognitively decline, until you start to mentally and emotionally decline. And you want to really be conscious of your relationship to this thing. Try and be as sustainable as you can, but be aware that maybe you have a 5-year window. Mark had an 8-year window, but maybe he was suffering for a longer period of time before he made the decision. It sounds like he was when I listened to the podcast. For me, I've been actively thinking about this for 6 months. If you are approaching your 4th, 5th, 6th year, that time window might be nearing for you. And I think it's really important that you start to think about more sustainable ways of creating, of marketing. So let's have a look at what that might be. As business owners, how do we market? So I want you to really be mindful of the ROI, of the energy that you're putting into different channels, right? You put a certain amount of energy into emailing your list. You probably don't email them enough. You probably don't put enough energy and effort into actually growing your list or nurturing them or even selling to them. So I think that email is a really powerful channel that has stood the test of time and will continue to do so. I would say you definitely want to be putting a lot of attention into that. There are so many incredible things that you can do with email where in your CRM, if you have a really good one, you can text your clients, right? Like you can actually gather the phone numbers of people and you can, follow up with them. You can have a great deal of personalization. You can email and segment previous customers and, kind of have that ongoing relationship with them. There's so much that you can do if you're interested in learning about email. There's actually a program that I'm going to be teaching relatively soon about email marketing, which I think is going to be great. But I think also something to be mindful of is the ROI of long form versus short form content. And so when I say short form, what I'm really looking at is TikToks, Facebook posts, Instagram, whether it's carousel content, single images or the reels. That is short form content that has a very short lifespan. And so a Instagram post might have a lifespan of 2 to 3 days, and then it will kind of be archived, it will get lost in the news feed. Obviously, your stories have a lifespan of 24 hours. Think about how much effort you put into doing a story, and it will never be seen again. And that's it. Maybe it stays on the highlights, but how many people are really going to be looking at those highlights all the time, going through and watching all the highlights? Not many. Doesn't have that lifespan. Versus a long form piece of content, such as a YouTube video or a podcast, where, we're looking at maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, definitely at least 20 minutes, but you're able to, in that depth, in that time, you're able to capture a lot of nuance. You're able to go deep. You're able to have context. You're able to really, really teach. You're able to really connect with someone and build that brand connection. And that long form piece of content lasts a really long time. I've had peers, with YouTube videos 5 years ago, 10 years ago say, yeah, I still have people go back to that video that I made a long time ago and they still watch it and then they find me and then they want to work with me. Or people still listen to old podcast episodes that I did ages ago. They type my name into Spotify and they still listen to them and then they reach out to me and they want to work with me. So those long form pieces of content have a very long lifespan. Once you create them once, they're there forever. So the amount of effort that you put into creating 3 posts a week for Instagram versus, not podcasting or not doing YouTube is really interesting. I would actually say that if I could give anyone advice on marketing strategy, that you want to be investing in the long form stuff, like really build stuff on YouTube, like take the time and the effort to do it well, do it right, do good editing, really write down what you want to say, prepare for the podcast episodes. But these are things that will give you so much presence, so much credibility, but you will just get so much more from the amount of effort and energy that you're putting into them, right? So the thing is with long form content is that you don't get that necessarily immediate return that you get with social media. And I think because we're so addicted to, we live in a world where we're governed by quick wins and fast response and we're very impatient, we become very overly reliant on the fast nature of the results that come from social media. But again, remember, when we prioritize speed, we sacrifice other things. So if you put time into building a YouTube channel or a podcast, the results aren't going to be immediate. If you already have an established brand, I think it'll be faster, but you will maintain your sanity and you will be able to turn those things into successful, viable marketing channels. So I think that's really important to know is the lifespan of that content, because we do need to create content as a business. It is a necessity. But, again, it's like depending on what kind of business you have, I recently hired a therapist and I did not find her on social media. I wasn't scrolling. What I did was I typed in Austin acceptance and commitment therapist. I opened 5 or 6 tabs, went through all the different websites, shortlisted 3 people, booked in a call with her, hired her on the spot in that discovery call. So it was a Google search, and I think that when we're actively looking for something specific, like a photographer or some kind of service, you really want to make sure that you are doing the work to be found on Google, because people are actively searching, and you want to make sure that you've got those bases covered, because that is going to be how a lot of people will make very quick, active decisions, right? So get those keywords going, invest in the other channels. Social media isn't the only thing there is. So to answer the question, can I not be on social media as a business owner? Is that possible? I think depending on the nature of the business that you have and depending on how established you are, I think it is possible. I think that you need to be mindful of the fact that it may be a slower burn, but there are so many other marketing channels that you can utilize and have a successful business. And I would really encourage you to play and experiment with those channels. So, to conclude today's episode, start by asking yourself, what is my number one core objective in life right now? Is it fulfillment, presence, mental health, human connection, love? Is it business growth? Is it brand growth? For me, I'm coming out of a big chapter where there was a huge focus on social media marketing and business building. And now my focus is on improving the quality of my writing. And so I want to be consuming more books and spending more time creative loafing in relationship to creativity and imagination. And so I'm going to attempt to reduce my relationship and alter my relationship with social media in this next chapter. When you do this exercise and you ask yourself these questions, I also want you to ask yourself, when you weigh it up, kind of like a pros and cons, on a yellow legal pad, is my relationship with social media as it stands right now a net positive or a net negative? Thank you so much for tuning in today. That was our episode on social media burnout. I hope that left you with some really valuable nuggets of insight, some really interesting alternatives and ways of looking at things, doing things, being more conscious and mindful, and also some questions to ask yourself so that you can potentially enter into a better relationship with social media.